$280 million. That is the staggering amount of value that just vanished practically overnight in the recent collapse of the XUSD stablecoin. It was this massive financial crater, right? It started with an external fund manager losing about $93 million, but it didn't stop there. It quickly spiraled into a full-blown systemic crisis that locked up $160 million in everyday user funds. So why did this happen? Well, it all comes down to the immense, often completely invisible stakes of leverage. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to explore a really fascinating and, honestly, pretty dangerous phenomenon that I like to call the leverage trap. Today, we're looking at how recursive loops and outsourced quick fixes create this massive illusion of control. It's a trap that literally ensnares everyone, from high-tech decentralized finance developers to rural homeowners and even the political leaders of modern democracies. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll define this illusion of control. Number 2, we'll examine DeFi's recursive leverage loops. Then, 3, we're jumping into Japan's rural real estate trap, followed by our 4th point, outsourcing borders. Finally, we'll wrap up with how to actually escape the leverage trap. Let's get right into it. Part 1, the illusion of control. So, what exactly do we mean by leverage in this context? At its core, leverage is basically borrowing against the future to solve a problem today. It's a quick fix. Think about it. Have you ever relied on a shortcut that temporarily made your life easier, only to realize years later that it had snowballed into a massive, inescapable liability? Yeah. That is the illusion of control. You think you're managing a problem, but you're actually just multiplying your exposure to it. Moving to part 2, DeFi's recursive leverage loops. Let's step into the incredibly fast-paced, high-stakes world of decentralized finance, or DeFi. The recent stream finance crisis gives us a perfect, terrifyingly mechanical view of how leverage essentially eats itself. So stream finance used what they called a yield arbitrage strategy. Sounds fancy, right? But looking closely at the mechanics underneath, it was really just a recursive leverage loop. It works like this. You deposit your XUSD stablecoin as collateral, then you use that to borrow other stablecoins, like USD0. Next, you use those borrowed coins to mint even more XUSD. Then you deposit that new XUSD and wash, rinse, repeat. Through this exact mechanism, Stream's actual real-world assets of $170 million were artificially pumped up to back a staggering $530 million in borrowing. And because of this, they were promising users these massive 18% yields on hundreds of millions of dollars. But the absolute absurdity here is that the collateral backing the asset was actually the asset itself. It was a total circular dependency. Now, when the market is going up, this looks like pure genius. But the literal second the music stops, the entire structure collapses inward, like a house of cards. Now, what's really interesting about this dynamic is the glaring contrast between the illusion and reality. To make matters even worse, Stream relied on a fixed Euler market oracle, which is basically an automated pricing mechanism. And that oracle hard-coded the price of XUSD at $1.27. So on the glittering front-end dashboard, the system is telling everyone, hey, everything is totally fine. But on the decaying back end, the crashing market reality was that XUSD was actually trading at just 26 cents. Because the system was literally programmed to ignore real-world volatility, the market just froze, liquidations failed, and lenders were instantly trapped holding a massive bag of bad debt. And look, this isn't just an isolated one-off incident. Take a look at Lido's Steth, which currently accounts for roughly 28% of all staked Ethereum. The base staking yield on that is a relatively safe, conservative 3.5%. But users can leverage that up to 15% on lending platforms like Aave's Prime Instance by utilizing a 95% loan-to-value ratio. Think about that for a second. That leaves a razor-thin 5% margin of safety. If the peg slips even slightly, boom, it triggers a cascading liquidation spiral. That flashy yield number isn't just a reward. It's a glowing red warning beacon showing exactly how many layers of hidden risk are sitting right underneath your position. Let's shift gears to part 3, Japan's rural real estate trap. I want to slow our pace down for just a moment and step away from the digital tokens of DeFi. We're going to pivot to physical land, specifically looking at a historical warning sign from Japan's macro bubble back in the 1980s. Because, as we'll see, the leverage trap isn't just a financial concept. It can be incredibly physical and demographic too. So, in the mid-1980s, Japan was experiencing this blistering asset price expansion. Urban excess from massive cities like Tokyo started spilling over into rural prefectures. Flush with the cheap credit, speculators just started buying up regional acreage for expressways, golf courses, vacation properties, you name it. But when the Bank of Japan aggressively hit the brakes and raised interest rates in 1991, the bubble popped hard. The secondary market completely seized up, and by the 2000s, rural liquidity had completely, utterly vanished. What happened next is that generational capital became entirely trapped in illiquid assets. This sparked what is known today as the Akiya crisis, which is this massive, systemic proliferation of vacant, abandoned homes all over Japan. Now, part of this was driven by a shrinking demographic curve and urban migration that sort of broke traditional inheritance lines. But actually, scratch that, one of the biggest drivers was the government's own tax code, specifically Article 343. This code perversely created a six-fold tax spike if an owner actually demolished an unused home. So families were financially forced to just leave rotting structures standing, locked into this permanent operational cash flow drain. Connecting this back to our loop metaphor for a second, that short-term speculative capital injection from the cities, it seemed like an amazing quick fix for rural economies at the time. But in reality, they were just layering highly volatile infrastructure onto a shrinking demographic foundation. And the back-end reality today? Shrinking municipal tax budgets, fragmented isolated communities, and extreme local illiquidity. They leveraged the present, and the future ended up footing the bill. Part 4. Outsourcing borders and political leverage. Now, we're going to pivot one more time into the political realm. Taking a strictly neutral analytical look here, we can actually observe these exact same leverage dynamics playing out in how modern democracies handle global migration. To manage really intense domestic political pressures regarding irregular migration, receiving democracies are increasingly relying on what are called transactional migration agreements, or TMAs. Basically, these are ad hoc bilateral arrangements. A destination state exchanges aid, development funds, or diplomatic favors with the transit country, and in return, they get the external enforcement of migration control. In essence, they are outsourcing their borders. So the crucial point is understanding why states actually do this. A big part of the reason is a massive gap in international law. The 1951 Refugee Convention was designed for individuals facing very specific targeted persecution. It was never built for mass displacement resulting from state collapse, environmental shocks, or extreme economic deprivation. Lacking the modern legal instruments to process these populations, democratic states just improvise. They use TMAs as a quick fix to insulate themselves from domestic political liabilities. But just like the crypto loops and the rural real estate speculation we looked at, this quick fix creates compounding strategic liabilities over time. By delegating the enforcement, destination states drastically reduce their own control over the actual outcomes. They expose themselves to coercive leverage, meaning foreign partner states can literally threaten to open the migration valves unless more financial concessions are paid out. And ultimately, it weakens their normative commitments to human rights and transparency. Again, it is an illusion of control that actually creates massive asymmetric dependence. Which brings us to part 5, escaping the leverage trap. So, how do we break these destructive loops? How do we stop borrowing against the future and actually solve the underlying structural realities? Let's move into our final act and look at some potential solutions. Looking at UNLV's academic research, we can clearly see our policy alternatives laid out. When dealing with incredibly complex systems, whether we're talking about international border policy or decentralized financial markets, states and institutions generally have a few distinct paths. They can try an exit doctrine and just walk away entirely. They can attempt massive legal category reform, or they can implement what researchers call a structured conditionality regime, or SCR. Now, the SCR offers the most politically and practically viable path forward. Instead of open-ended dependencies or these crazy recursive loops, the SCR framework demands strict, rule-bound cooperation. It essentially ties continued engagement and funding directly to measurable performance metrics. And crucially, it relies on time-limited engagement. It forces accountability right back into the system, ensuring that a quick fix doesn't silently mutate into a permanent, crippling liability down the road. And this brilliantly illustrates the core lesson of our entire explainer today. Breaking the loop requires confronting structural reality, instead of just outsourcing it. In the crypto world, it means things like Lido's V3 upgrade, introducing modular, customizable risk vaults, rather than relying on blind recursive leverage. In Japan, it means doing the hard work of untangling ancient tax codes and using municipal Akiya banks to slowly, deliberately match vacant homes with real buyers, rather than relying on massive central subsidies. And in statecraft, it means using structured conditionality at borders to tie cooperation to measurable, concrete outcomes. Ultimately, survival in any complex system requires facing the music today rather than pushing the dead to tomorrow. Which leaves us with one final lingering question to reflect on. Whether you're analyzing your own investments, running your business, or looking at the policies you vote for, are we actually solving our structural problems, or are we just leveraging them? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the loops, and I'll see you next time.